Good afternoon, everyone. So as Roland said, I will give a talk on human-flood interactions in a changing climate. And the talk will touch on recent research in the field of interplay between floods and people. And I will show a combination of case studies, modeling exercise, as well as the opportunity offered by new data sets, global data sets, also coming from remote sensing. Roland has already mentioned that I have been deeply involved in Pantarei Everything Flows, and the research I'm going to present today fits into this big umbrella. Pantarei is the current research decade of the International Association of Hydrological Sciences, IHS, and which brings together more than 300 water scientists worldwide, and it focuses on changing hydrology and society. The name Pantarei originates from Heraclitus of Ephesus, which more than 2,500 years ago, to make the point that nothing is permanent except change, referred to the relationship between water and people. He said that no man ever steps in the same river twice, for it is not the same river and is not the same man. So on the spirit of Heraclitus, a lot of research has been done on the relationship between hydrology and society. And in particular, what I will speak about today is the relationship between society and floods. So first of all, when we look into flood events around the world, we are not speaking merely about natural hazards, as humans strongly alter flood regimes. The frequency, the magnitude, as well as the spatial distribution of floods is altered by human activities. And this alteration is both deliberate, for instance, through water infrastructure or risk reduction measures, such as levees or reservoirs, to attenuate floods, or accidental, such as changes in land use, urbanization, and deforestation, which can change the characteristic of floods, as well as the unintended consequences of some measures or water infrastructure. In the slide here, what we see, for instance, is the evolution of the impact of reservoirs on rivers around the world over the past 100 years. We can see that today, most rivers of our planet are strongly influenced by the presence of dams and reservoirs. While society shapes floods, floods in their turn shape society. Humans continuously respond to flood events. The occurrence of flood events can alter institutions, demographics, as well as policy. The response to floods can be a formal response, for instance, a change in policy on how to deal with flood risk, or the introduction of new water infrastructure, such as building dikes or levees to protect areas from frequent flooding. But there can also be more informal type of responses, such as spontaneous processes like learning on how to cope with flooding, as well as migration. In this slide, there is an example which is taken from Bangladesh. Bangladesh is a land in which the flows of water and people is extremely dynamic. And what we can see here is how Abdul, which was one of the persons which was interviewed by my PhD student Ferdous Ruknul, has been changing the place and his house over time, the location of his house over time, to deal with flooding and river erosion. We can see that almost every year he had to change his location. And the remote sensing image shows also that the river is changing the course because of river erosion. Bangladesh is an extreme example, but we also see in other places around the world institutional changes following the occurrence of major events. So there is a mutual shaping between floods and society, and this mutual shaping gives rise to numerous phenomena. I show three key phenomena that make very difficult to make predictions of flood risk over time. The first one is the so-called safe development paradox, which is also known in the flood risk literature as levee effect, which is when we put in place risk reduction measures, but as a paradox, we have increasing losses. In the picture that we see here is taken in New Orleans, the flooding in 2005, which was catastrophic. And what we see is that in many places around the world, the construction of levees may reduce the frequency of flooding, but at the same time, it is often associated with an urbanization of flood-prone areas with these catastrophic damages when the levee eventually fails. I will speak more about this paradox later on. At the same time, people also learn how to live with flooding. And we also have success stories around the world of adaptation. We see that consecutive flood events can be associated with learning dynamics and lead to decreasing losses over time. This has been the case, for instance, in Bangladesh over the past decades. And lastly, we can have cascading effects. When we deal with water resources, we often have two types of hydrological streams, droughts and floods. And measures that we put in place to respond to droughts may have the unintended consequences of exacerbating future flood losses. So this type of phenomena make the process of water management very complex, as well as the goal of disaster risk reduction. And to understand this phenomena over the past few years, more and more scholars in the water sector have been focusing on social hydrology. One of the main goals of social hydrology is to understand and model this phenomena or unintended consequences that are generated by the mutual shaping of hydrology and society. So the focus is to see what type of dynamics, opportunities and risk can be generated by the feedback mechanism between hydrological and social processes. And indeed, social hydrology is not the first research field which is dealing with water and people. It builds upon a long history of science. I already mentioned Heraclitus at the beginning of my lecture, but more recently, water resources systems, integrated water resources management, as well as studies of social ecological systems have provided many insights on the type of dynamics that can be generated by human-nature interactions. What we are doing more and more in the field is to get engaged with political and behavioral science to better understand the way in which societies impact and respond to floods and droughts. So I will now give a little bit more details about the phenomena that I've mentioned before. The first one is about adaptation. And what we see in this slide is the number of flood fatalities in Bangladesh over the past decades. And these casualties are normalized by the flooded area. And what we can see, they have been decreasing quite substantially in the period under consideration. Also, please note that the y-axis is on a log scale. So we are speaking about orders of magnitude of reduction of flood fatalities. And this is due to a combination of formal and informal factors. To name a few of them, increased education in the general population and the introduction of early warning systems. However, if we zoom in into Bangladesh, we also see other type of dynamics and phenomena that are emerging there. One of my PhD students, Ferdous Ruknul, has been working in Bangladesh for many years, and he focused on this study area, which is highlighted in this slide. And this study area is a very interesting one, as it allows us to make experiment in a one-to-one lab. We have a river reach of the Jamuna River, also known as the Brahmaputra River, in which we have many people living inside the river into these small islands called also chars, like Abdul, which I showed in the previous slide. And then we have the right-hand side, which is protected by an embankment, by levees that were built in the 70s. And on the left side, we have unprotected rural area. So in this way, we can see how different socio-hydrological spaces have been generated through a co-evolution between water and people. So we have, again, people on the socio-hydrological space 1, which are protected by a levee, and in the socio-hydrological space 3, which is unprotected floodplain. And then we have people living into the river, which are every year changing their location due to river erosion and flooding. And by analyzing, by working with these communities and by analyzing data, we have been looking at this different type of dynamics. And one of them is that while Bangladesh as a whole clearly shows a tendency to adapt to adaptation and reducing losses over time, there are local areas in which we see the emergence of the safe development paradox, which is this area which is protected by the levee, which was built in the 70s. So we can see population density in 1961, and then population density in 2011. And the slides show that the area which is protected in the floodplain, in this area, population has grown much more. And this means that when we have extreme flood events and the levees are overtopped, flood losses are catastrophic, since more people are affected. Not only more people are affected, but also people living there are more vulnerable to flooding, possibly to less experience to deal with flooding. And we found that flood mortality rates are higher in protected areas. So in this case study, we see an example of how levees on one end have the benefit of reducing flood hazard, since they reduce the frequency of flooding, but this often comes to the expense of increasing vulnerability and increasing exposure. Increasing vulnerability since people are less used to cope with flooding, or there is a sense of complacency, and increased exposure since we have increasing population density in flood-prone areas. We have been trying to develop models to explain past changes in flood risk and also explore future possibilities. And in these models, we bring together natural and social processes, as well as the role of technology. For instance, in the model that I show here, which is one of the first socio-hydrological models, we made a link between 5 key variables: flooding, the wealth, the average distance of a urban area from the river, and the height of the levee system. And then we introduce a social variable called flood memory, and we make the assumption that flood memory is a primary mechanism which explains phenomena such as adaptation versus safe development paradox. So the hypothesis of our model, I'm not giving details of the model, but I would like to introduce the key concepts behind it. So the hypothesis is that flood losses build memory, societal memory, at the collective level, which then tends to decay over time. And the mathematical equation is reproduced here, but the key concept can be seen also through empirical data. If we focus on the California diagram here, we can see, for instance, that after the 1997 floods, the number of insurance policy per capita raised, more people bought flood insurance, but then this decayed over time quite rapidly. And we can make the assumption that flood insurance, so the proportion of people buying flood insurance, is a proxy of flood memory, which is accumulated with the occurrence of flooding and then decays over time. By using this process, we can, by using this model, we can simulate the behavior of different type of flood systems. And to introduce you to this modeling exercise, I'll provide I provide an example based on a very simple exercise in which I focus on two prototypes of flood systems. A green system here on the left-hand side, in which we have that we have society dealing with floods mainly through non-structural measures, such as resettling outside of the floodplain. So we have an historical city center, which is highlighted in the beige color, and then new developments which get close to the river, since floodplains offer favorable conditions for economic development, but not too close to minimize flood losses. On the right-hand side, we have a technical system which primarily deal with flooding through structural measures, such as building levees, dikes, to protect flood-prone areas. So here we say the same, we can see the same historical city center, which is developing differently, and we have, it gets closer to the river, we have more industrialization and economic growth. So we have some benefits living in the floodplain, as for instance, they offer favorable conditions for transportation. So these are two prototypes of societies. Very often, reality is somewhere in the middle. However, it's often also either close to the green system or the technical system, since there is a tendency of lock-in conditions that I will mention later on. What I would like to say now is that green systems are representative of many floodplains in the global south, while the technical systems is representative of many flood systems in the global north, especially in Europe, US, and Australia. And indeed, the Netherlands is the most striking example of a technical system which is heavily relying on structural measures such as levees to protect urbanized areas from flooding. To illustrate the capability of the model and the potential, but also to discuss human flood interactions in a changing climate, I will show a very simple exercise that we did a few years ago, which is essentially we make a simulation in which we make the assumption that flood levels over 2 centuries, the severity of flood levels is increasing. And this is being simulated by making assumption of sea level rise, if we are referring to coastal flooding, or increasing discharge due to increasing heavy precipitation events, if we are referring to river flooding. So the exercise that I'm doing applies to both river and coastal flooding. There are a few differences that we may discuss later on, but we can focus now on the exercise. So I will guide you through this diagram. If we consider this scenario of increasing high water levels over time due to climate change and sea level rise, in a green system, the results are here on the left-hand side. So in a green system, levees are never built over time, so their height is always equal to 0. And anytime we have high water levels, flood memory is accumulated. Then it tends to decay, but then it's refreshed shortly after, since we have many flood events throughout history. If we look into in terms of damage, we can see that very often this green system has flood damage, but flood damage is normally limited. It happens often, but it is never too big. And we also see the emergence of adaptation effects. Similar flood events on the 60s and 70s lead to decreasing losses over time due to adaptation and refreshed memory. On the right-hand side, we have high water levels. In this case, we can see that as soon as we have the first high water levels, levees are built, and then they are raised more and more over time. If we focus on the period between 1953 up to 2040 or something, we can see that in this period, levees are pretty high, or these high water levels do not produce flooding, since the levee is higher than the high water level, and flood memory goes almost to 0. But then when flooding occurs, also because of climatic change, the damage is catastrophic. We see here more than 60% of damage, which may lead to the collapse of the system, depending on the scale we are looking at. So this type of technical system tends to generate this safe development paradox that we see in this period. So long periods in which we many years in which we have no losses, there is increased confidence on the system. We believe levees, they work. This area is flood proof, but then when the flood occurs, damages are catastrophic, as it was the case in New Orleans in 2005. So the goal of our modeling exercise is to compare different types of strategies to support the policy-making process, to guide data collection, what type of data we need to collect to understand how flood risk changes over time. And clearly the role of flood memory or risk awareness is key in understanding these dynamics. And also what we see is that this simple model can explain emerging phenomena such as the safe development paradox and adaptation. So clearly, the model is very simplified. So what we've been doing over the past years is also to enrich the model by considering different type of cultures. Most of us, I guess, also in the audience, live in the European countries, but there are different type of cultures as well as governance around the world. So in recent work, we have also been considering what type of human flood interactions emerge when we consider different type of culture, fatalist, egalitarians, hierarchist, or individualist. And to do this, we use prototypes of risk perception adapted from Thomson myths of nature. And we found that very different type of dynamics emerge if individuals and societies neglect, control, downplay, or tends to monitor flood risk. And indeed, when we speak about flood memory, we know that we are making simplification, because if we look into specific case studies, the role of direct experience with floods is much richer than just building up a flood memory. For instance, we have been doing a flood risk awareness after the 2018 flooding in Negrar near Verona in Italy, and we found that previous experience with floods influence risk awareness not only directly by building flood memory, but also indirectly through the knowledge that individuals gain from that experience. So case studies enable us to enrich what we get from the models, and at the same time also can help us enrich the model itself. Then when we try to understand human flood interaction, it's also important to go beyond the specific test sites. So what we always try to understand is whether certain dynamics occur only in a specific place, or they can be generalized. And if they can be generalized, when they can be generalized. For this reason, a great opportunity is offered nowadays by remote sensing data, allowing global analysis of human flood interactions. I present one example of this type of analysis based on satellite nighttime lights. So these are provided by NOAA, and they allow us to know the intensity of light in the period 1992-2013 at 1 kilometer resolution for the entire world. And what we did was to use them as proxies of the spatial distribution of human settlements. And we're trying to understand what is the relationship between changes in the spatial distribution of human settlements and the occurrence of catastrophic flood events. So what we found out is the following. So if we look into this slide, this diagram on the left-hand side, we see that countries in which that were affected by more by floods, so through flood fatalities, were also the countries in which human settlements on average have increased their distance from the river. So this shows that there is a tendency to adapt to flooding. Indeed, there are many different factors that are determining the spatial distribution of human settlements, but flooding as a signal. So we found that flood fatalities can explain increasing distance from the river when we look at different countries around the world. However, this tendency to adapt is reduced when we have higher level of flood protection, which is the diagram that we have here on the right-hand side. What we can see here is that as we increase flood protection levels, moving from 10 years return period in Mozambique, which is a very low protection level, to the 1,000 years protection level in the Netherlands, then we have this tendency to increase the distance from the river when flooding occurs tend to decrease. As after flood events, the focus is on rebuilding a new levee or repairing them or strengthening them rather than resettling outside floodplain areas. So this global analysis shows that indeed adaptation and safe development paradox are general patterns that can be found elsewhere and they tend to emerge in different conditions. Then another aspect which is very important to consider is that when we look into flood risk, we cannot only focus on floods. Some years ago, we did a study in Africa, and we were trying to explain why flood fatalities have increased so dramatically over the past decades. You can see in this diagram from the 1950s up to the end of the last decade, a very dramatic increase, about 10 times more flood fatalities. And what we found out is that flood discharge did not increase substantially in this period, but what increased substantially was the number of people living in floodplain. So not only population growth as a whole in the African continent, but population growth in the floodplain, which was more than in the entire continent. And at that time, we attribute this to increasing incentives to settle close to rivers. And one role can be played also by drought event. So the human response to drought can exacerbate the impact of floods. For instance, when we have individuals and communities migrating out from drought, heavily affected areas, affected by drought, that they get close to rivers and get more exposed to flooding. So this is an example of cascading effects, when responding to one specific hazard can exacerbate the impact of other hazards. So, another example is the case of Brisbane in Australia. In this case, it's not about human population dynamics, but more about water management. So in Brisbane, a flood control reservoir was built in the 1980s. And this is an interesting story as this reservoir indeed attenuated floods. And for many decades, Brisbane did not experience any flooding event. And there was the feeling that Brisbane was flood-proof thanks to this new flood control reservoir. However, a prolonged drought occurred in Australia at the beginning of the millennium. This is known as the Millennium Drought, and it lasts 10 years from 2001 to 2010. And in this period, the way in which this reservoir has been operated started to change. And in particular, while a flood control reservoir is supposed to be as empty as possible, since we want to use the reservoir to store the water from heavy precipitation to prevent extreme flood peaks. During the drought, this reservoir was kept as full as possible to buffer low flow conditions and to support farmers and agriculture. However, at the end of the drought, there was an heavy precipitation event in 2011, and there was too much water in the reservoir to attenuating flooding. And the flooding was devastating, one of the most catastrophic floods in Australia. So these cascading effects, one way to explain them is to use the concept of availability heuristic. What you see in this picture is Fesky and Daniel Kahneman. And Kahneman got his Nobel Prize for the study on cognitive science. And the availability heuristic states that people and decision makers assess risk based on how easily examples of harm come into their mind. I guess many of us are living availability heuristic, for instance, in terms of concern about the pandemic, about COVID-19, as we very easily get examples of harm into our mind because of experience, direct or indirect experience, and media coverage. So the availability heuristic is a process, and it's not only about people, it's also about scientists, decision makers. We are all prone to this heuristic and cognitive bias. And what we are doing with the new developments is to model the interactions between floods, droughts, and society by considering the decay of flood and drought awareness. So not only flood memory, but also how the water managers have different levels of awareness with respect to flood and drought risk, and how this can give rise to different type of dynamics and unintended consequences in managing floods. Lastly, in our research, we try to tackle scientific challenges, which is what I've been speaking about so far. So the main phenomena such as safe development paradox, adaptation, cascading effects in dealing with flood risk, but also we try to do something which is useful to address societal challenges. And today, many countries around the world are mobilizing resources to address the sustainable development goals. And in this field, social hydrology can help unravel trade-off to meet water-related targets. If we look into the SDGs, in fact, there are many SDGs that are water-related. And there is the SDG 6, which is actually about water, clean water and sanitation, but also other SDGs are connected with flood risk. This table, we see a connection between different socio-hydrological phenomena and the SDGs that can be affected by the emergence of these phenomena. So if we don't account for them, we cannot address SDGs. The table seems very complicated, so let me focus on the safe development paradox, which is kind of the focus of the lecture today, and three goals. One which comes from the SDG 8, which is to sustain per capita economic growth. Then the 11, which is to reduce death from water-related disasters. And the 13, which is about strengthening resilience to climate-related hazards, including floods. So what we have seen before is that, for instance, when we put in place structural protection measures, we can sustain per capita economic growth since we have an urbanization of the floodplain, which is normally driving fast economic growth, but this comes at the expense of reducing deaths from water-related disasters, since they can be very catastrophic when they occur, as well as strengthening resilience. So if we go back to the model exercise that I showed before, we can see the concept of trade-off. So a green system, it's growing over time. We have flood losses, which are these small vertical bars, but the growth is not very fast. On the technical system, economic growth is much faster. Wealth is growing very rapidly, but then when flood occurs, flood losses are very high. So by using socio-hydrological models, we can find trade-off between green and technical systems. So to find a balance between the need to support socio-economic growth and the one of protecting the environment and reducing flood losses. I can show this also with a sample of short-term versus long-term policies. When we try to address the SDGs and we look into the topic of flood risk, all the phenomena that I've been speaking about can be seen as a legacy. So what we have done in the past is a legacy to the present. For instance, if we have built levees to protect flood-prone areas, these flood-prone areas has been urbanized, and this may lead to a lock-in condition, because as we have this area which is urbanized, then we may get higher levies to protect this area, since it has become, there are many people living there. But then if we have higher levies, this area is perceived even as safer, and we have increasing urbanization. So it's a self-reinforcing feedback, which leads to a condition of high protection levels, very low probability of flooding, but catastrophic consequences in case of flooding. So it can be seen as a legacy of the past, what we see in the present, but also our present decision will be a legacy for the future. For this reason, when we make decisions in water management or flood risk management, we need to consider always the long-term implication of that policy. Very often we try to focus on the short term. Even the SDGs, they have the horizon in 2030, which is only 9 years from now. So if we consider alternative policies, we may prefer a policy like this one, which looks better in 2030, but is going to look much worse in the future. While what we would like to achieve is to have long-term policies that keeps on giving benefits in the long term. I will give an example about this by showing how we can decompose these two diagrams. The short-term policy, as an example of SDGs, can be seen as a combination of growing the real GDP per capita, and which is growing over time at the expense of water-related ecosystems, which is another SDG. And what we can see is that at the beginning, the composite of these two performance versus SDG tends to increase. But then at some point, when the water-related ecosystems is degraded, when we have degraded the environment, then this is going to backfire also in terms of GDP per capita. And this may lead also a composite performance decreasing over time. So pursuing fast economic growth at the expense of the environment can backfire in the long term. While what we try to achieve with our models, especially also with a focus on flood risk, is to reach a level in which we can indeed have some socioeconomic growth, but not as fast as this one, without jeopardizing the environment, without degrading the environment, protecting the ecosystem, so that the policy is more sustainable on the long term. This requires, among other things, not to overreact to specific events. And always keep in mind that today's decisions will affect our lives for decades to come. So to summarize my talk for the day, which was about human flood interactions in a changing climate, I provided an overview of the scientific challenges we are facing and the need for interdisciplinary work on the interplay between floods and society. What I've been trying to show is that fixing problem with flood risk is not as easy as it may look. Whenever we put a measure in place, this measure can have the intended benefits, but it can also have many unintended consequences. And it can also have an uneven distribution of cost and benefits. Very often, costs are for some social groups and benefits can be for other social groups. At the same time, I've also been touching on societal challenges. In particular, as many countries around the world are trying to address water-related targets set by the SDGs, it is important to have this socio-hydrological understanding and also models that can help us explore different trade-offs between social, environmental, and economic priorities and reduce legacy risk so that the decisions we make today are sustainable on the long run. Thank you.